directive that I disagree with. But this one was so contrary to my principles and everything I had stood for as a federal prosecutor for almost 20 years that it was a stark, it was not a difficult decision. When the directive came down, I didn't think too much about it before resigning.
And Liz, you described that moment that you asked directly the CEO if they were building killer robots. Did you contemplate at all, have any sort of wishy-washiness in your decision to quit, or was it also so clear for you?
You know, I will be the first to admit that I was in denial about the changes that were happening at the company for a long time. It was a great job. I was really close with everybody. We were very good friends. And we believed in the company and believed that it was possible to do this work the right way. Things change slowly, and suddenly you realize it kind of all at once. And so for me, it was when Google walkout happened, and there was this massive employee activism going on at other tech companies where they were also working on the same project. That prompted me to start asking questions. And to answer your question directly, when the CEO told us that I was right, that we were right, it wasn't a hard decision at all. I went home, cried, and quit the very next day.
And Josh, you mentioned a couple things. Yours feels almost like it was building, or was there a specific instance where it became ultimately really clear for you?
Well, I think, working on security assistance and arms transfers for over a decade, you're aware that it is a morally hazardous area of work, that, even the best decisions, you are signing off on weapons that are going to, at some point, quite possibly be responsible for civilian harm. And I think despite that, I had worked in the role, stayed in the role for over a decade, because I felt that there was good to be done, sometimes very direct good in the context of, I would argue, our security assistance to Ukraine in the face of Russia's onslaught, sometimes a more incremental good, recognizing you're a small piece of a very big bureaucratic system in terms of trying to nudge things in a better direction. Although, I had a resignation letter prepared and in my desk under the previous Trump administration back in 2019 in the context of US arms sales to the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. I think the tipping point for me in this context was, again, first of all, that scale and scope of harm, which was unlike anything I'd seen before, but it was predictable. And after Hamas's vicious illegal attack on October 7th, I wrote an email to colleagues at senior levels in the department and said, I know what the impetus is going to be here, but before we rush to throw more weapons at a problem where it is clear that, providing arms, providing security assistance has not led to security, and indeed, is only going to lead to more suffering, as we've seen previously, although, not at the scale that we've now come to see. Can we stop and think? And was met, with no response to the email. A couple of people picked up a phone and called, and one said, are you crazy? Are you trying to get fired? And the other said, thank you for saying that. But then it was watching things unfold in the days that followed where, sure enough, the spigot was opened, immense harm was being done, certainly to the Palestinians, also, I would argue, to America's own interests as well in the region around the world. And yet there was this complete unwillingness to have any sort of discussion or debate. And just very quickly, to get to your sort of precise point, I was overseas for a few days in the period, in mid-October of 2023, and I started drafting a resignation letter, and I said, but you know what, let me get back to the State Department. Maybe there's something I'm missing. Let me go, read the classified intel. Maybe there's something happening there that I'm not aware of, to try and slow things down, to try and wrap things to a ceasefire. And I came back, and the first thing I did was went and looked, and there wasn't, and that was when I resigned.
And I'm going to ask you all this question, but let's start with you, Josh. Was there a insistence internally with yourself to think, maybe I should stay and try to change things from the inside?
So, first of all, I mean, when I tendered my resignation, first thing my boss said was, "Can we find you something else to do?" And I said directly, "I'm not resigning so that just so I'm not complicit. I'm resigning so that I can work and argue against this." I think in the situation where I was in, where I was literally one of the people in the approval process for arms sales, for arms transfers, and that space for any policy debate was taken away in the sense that you had the Secretary of State, the President, the Undersecretary of State saying you will approve these sales, there was absolutely no space to have any impact. And so for me, it was clear cut. It wasn't a question of if I leave, will someone else do this in a way I wouldn't want them to, because it was being driven from the top. I think for a lot of other people in other roles in the State Department, including some who are still there, the answer is, on the other hand, particularly if you're working on humanitarian assistance, if you're trying to get help to people who are starving, who are being bombarded, then absolutely there's an argument to be made to stay and to try and do what you can. It's just that in the context I was in, there wasn't any of that space for any of such opportunity.
Yeah, and Liz, what about you? I'm assuming it's kind of similar, that the CEO's directive was, we're spending a lot of money doing this and this is profitable.
That's exactly right. And the letter that I wrote, and along with my colleagues we wrote together, was our attempt to try to suggest that these use cases weren't just dual use, that they were actually going to be directly harmful, not only to individuals, but to the global geopolitical order and an arms race between near-peer rivals like US, China, and Russia. And by writing the letter, we were pointing out that this technology was not just available to our direct, government, but also to other governments who were writing in and asking for demos and asking for access that weren't always democracies or weren't always the most straightforward or believable use cases. So when we tried and truly believed that we might have some ability to influence the CEO to say, we can do, XYZ, but never that. And when it became clear that that was off the table entirely, it was a pretty easy decision to make from there.
Yeah, and John, you said you can read an org chart, but sometimes that org chart and those directives just go too far. So was there any way to try to resist or, hang in there without following directly those directives?
Yeah, in normal times, and there are always disagreements between prosecutors and anybody on the line in any government agency and the leadership of that agency, which is ultimately accountable to the political leadership of the country. I think there are different priorities that each administration brings. Sometimes you agree with those priorities, sometimes you don't. And in that context, I think it's critical that career civil servants do stay in those roles so that we have a cadre of subject matter experts who are career, who are not political, who are carrying out the job in the best interests of the public, of the people. In this context, this was just such an extreme deviation from anything that I had ever witnessed or heard of or contemplated in an individual criminal case. Criminal enforcement is something that I think is such a powerful tool. It has to be wielded very carefully and apolitically. And you can have a new administration come in and have prioritize immigration enforcement. You can have a different administration come in and prioritize civil rights enforcement. And they can dedicate more resources to enforcing crimes. But the baseline for that kind of enforcement is that there is an actual crime and there is truly objective analysis happening, driving the decisions about whether to charge someone with a crime. And this was such a deviation from that, to get essentially a directive that was being relayed from the White House to dismiss criminal charges in an individual case for political reasons. There was no way that I could personally continue in my role and abide a directive like that. I thought it was too damaging to the institution and to our country more broadly to follow that order. And as bad as that was, I think it's gotten worse to see the criminal justice system wielded against political enemies when there's not a factual or legal basis to do it. So those are just lines that I couldn't cross.
Yeah, there are people who did follow that order because it happened. What sort of response, and for all of you, did you get internally within your organization when you decided to leave, to resign on principle?
My office was distraught, not because I was anything special, but because they knew what it meant, which was if I wasn't going to do it, the directive was likely to, flow down to lower levels. And so there was just so much at that time. This is February of last year. There was so much apprehension and concern and anxiety within the Department of Justice, and I think for those that are still there, for a lot of them, it continues, that this was just kind of another blow to people who had really worked their entire academic careers to get into these positions, and were now being faced with enforcement directives that they couldn't follow in good conscience, and they didn't know whether they should give up their careers, and they didn't know how to deal with directives from political leadership when they didn't have the normal channels of leadership, career leadership in place to try and insulate them. And so it was a very kind of depressing, distraught time for my office.
Yeah, and Liz, what about you? Were you an outlier? Did people think it was, that you were nuts to leave, or did you have a lot of quiet support?
I think everybody was pretty grateful to have the truth, and a couple of weeks after I left, several other senior leaders and many other people ended up following suit. And of course, it takes time to set up something else for yourself, and so these delays were inevitable. But I will say it was one hell of a going away party. So I do think that people were grateful to at least have the facts, and there was a lot of quiet commiseration that this organization was not what we had been sold that it was supposed to be, and that those times and those dreams had ended. But at the same time, people were grateful that they could now then make decisions for themselves.
Yeah. And what about you, Josh?
Yeah, I think maybe if I can start with the exception and then talk about the rule. I mean, the exception is, I'm sorry to say, that there were certainly some colleagues, some people I had worked with, who I had leaned on for mentorship in the national security communications space, who I saw as I was leaving, and the days, weeks, months, years that followed, being misleading to the point of misinforming and being biased to the point of dehumanizing. And I think it is very disappointing to see that in people who you think are good people. But that's the exception. The rule was, so my last day in the office, I went around to every office that I worked with in the State Department and explained why I was leaving, and everyone understood, gave their support. As I said, my boss, when I resigned, said, "Can we find you something else to do?" And then after leaving, stayed in touch with an awful lot of people within government who, we continue to communicate. I try to support them when they face tough decisions. And I will also say that I've been met with an outpouring of incredible support and friendship from communities around the country, which has just been incredibly moving.
All of your cases were very high profile, got a lot of media attention. Were there any outside threats against you in this moment of political violence, a polarized environment? Did you feel like you were personally at risk? For anyone to answer.
I never felt at risk, but I also largely stay off social media and websites. You know, if you look for it, you can find people saying, at least I could, based on that situation, find people saying disparaging things. I had others tell me that they saw things online written about me, but I didn't really engage any of that content, and so no, I've never felt threatened or that, you know, my family and I weren't safe as a result of the you know, visibility on what happened. You know, professionally and economically, it's different. But in terms of physical security, I haven't ever had any concerns.
Yeah.
I'm impressed. Not reading the comments about yourself, that's superhero level.
I
No
know.
thanks.
I definitely can't say the same for myself. I read the comments and, you know, there was some hate mail, but ultimately I agree that the risks are more of a, you know, in your career, will you be able to work the same types of jobs for the same companies? Is this person going to actually litigate against you and attack you, and like what would that look like financially? And so you know, it was not easy to do, but I had a lot of support, especially from someone at the ACLU who was wonderful. He's the person that I reached out to at the very first moment I decided.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
if not, that's great.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Yeah, great.
mean tweets. I mean, I think at the end of the day, once you've given up your job, your career, you know, aside from physical threats, which I, you know, have never experienced, what else is there to take away from you? I think it's actually, in some ways, very freeing, because you can say what you truly believe, and, you know, there is no price that you have not almost already paid.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. The personal and professional financial risk with making such a big decision. I'm assuming none of you had jobs before you made this decision. And, you know, so many of you in this audience are young, but the older you get, the scarier that gets. So, you know, can you each talk about that, about how you dealt with that? If you, you know, how hard was it to find another job after this?
I guess I can start with that one. I mean, I didn't have a job lined up. I had a plan lined up, which was, well, you know, after I resign on this, I'm not going to find another job in DC, but, you know, I have friends in the world, and I've worked in the world of overseas, you know, security sector reform. I can, you know, go contract for some company in Latin America or the Far East or something like that, and I'll be fine. So I had a plan. I also, because I'd been in a you know, director level job at the State Department for a dozen years, had some savings. I knew I had 6 months of runway. So I thought I'd figure it out. As it turned out, it took more than 6 months. You know, it took a year or so before I and one of the other people who resigned over the same issue, but from the Department of Education, co-founded a new organization that we now, you know, manage together and are building to try and shift America's approach in this space. But I think for a lot of people, that concern is very, very real. I know for some people in State Department who've thought about resigning, it's losing the health insurance. It's, you know, you have kids in college that are significant weights, I think, on against people making those leaps.
Yeah, and you said something interesting, which is you knew that you would not be able to get a job in DC. And so...
Yes, here I am. So
yeah, you're here.
Built myself the job, so that's the way to do it.
Well, you survived, but that's, you know, it's an example of how pervasive a move like that could be in a city and an industry that might want some distance from you when making such a stance. And so, Liz, what about you? How did you deal with that professionally, financially? And
yeah, I think it's honestly in some ways a similar story. When I quit, I knew I had 3 to 6 months to figure things out. And 2 days after I resigned, I sent an encrypted email to the project head at the ACLU, and he hopped on the phone with me. And the first thing out of his mouth was, "You do not have to do this." I think so many of us feel like we have the responsibility that nobody else is willing to take, and it's just not true. And I really loved how focused he was on the well-being of the individual. It just so happened that at that moment in time, there was so much groundswell support for employee activism, and specifically around AI and AI ethics. It was sort of the beginning of the field of responsible AI, that I happened to meet someone at a conference that the company had paid for me to go to that same day that I wrote the encrypted email. And he and I decided to start a company together. He had already found some ideas. He had been building something similar. And I told him, that my plan was to come forward and be embroiled in some degree of controversy. And he, luckily for me, welcomed it. When I spoke with that man at the ACLU, I asked him, do you think I'll ever have a job in tech again? And he said, probably not at Google. But there are other opportunities. There may be smaller scale. There may be with, a limited amount of people who think about things the same way. But if you can forge your own path through it, it is possible to make it out alive.
Yeah, and John, also, you left in an environment where law firms were making deals with the Trump administration, refusing to hire people who spoke out against the Trump administration, refusing to hire people from the Biden administration. So how did you land?
Well, first of all, I think the decision to leave was actually relatively easy, as we've talked about, because it was something that was so blatant. But the aftermath of the decision was not something I had fully grappled with or anticipated. And so it's not a decision that I recommend anyone take lightly. I think I also recommend all of you, as you are moving through your careers, you never want to be in a position where you're looking for a job without a job. That is a situation where you have the least amount of leverage possible, and it can be very stressful and anxiety-inducing. And so, in some ways, I was very fortunate. My wife, we were able to just switch over to her insurance, her health insurance, for our kids. But there were colleagues of mine who were not married or whose spouses didn't have insurance or didn't work. And they had to go on these COBRA plans, which are, if you don't have employer-sponsored healthcare, that's your option essentially, at extreme cost. I mean, $2,000 a month, and they were out of work, some of them for 12 months or over a year. And so not only are they not bringing salary in, but they're paying an additional $2,000 a month just for health insurance. And so it can be, it was for a lot of people a very grim situation, especially if you're trying to provide health insurance for your family. That particular challenge, was not one that I was faced with, but just the prospect of not having a job, literally, the comments about kind of mapping out, well, I have 3 or 6 months. I think when you say it, it can sound like that's a lot of time, but when you're thinking, well, I have maybe max 6 months until I can no longer pay my mortgage, it doesn't feel like a lot of time. And the legal industry was, I wouldn't say retaliatory, but they were very reluctant to publicly associate themselves with anybody who was adverse to the Trump administration. I think that is still true to some extent, but it was especially true at the very beginning of the administration. And so a lot of my colleagues really struggled to find work in the private sector, and these are some of the most qualified, most credentialed, most impressive lawyers in the country. And so that's not fair, and that is a real challenge. And I was fortunate and ended up being hired by some people who were like-minded and who were willing to risk their own company, their own law firm, by bringing me on. But it was not pleasant to be trying to find a job in that environment and kind of having left so abruptly without a plan for the transition.
Yeah. We're going to open it up to questions in a couple minutes, but before we do, would you all do it again? Knowing what you know now. Anyone can go first.
Yeah, I don't feel like I had much of a choice, honestly. I think, and when you're motivated enough to do something, to take that kind of a risk, you know, you are already accepting the possible consequences. You understand that that's not going to be, you know, the same world that you lived in the day prior. And I think the reason you do it is because you have seen something, you have experienced something that you cannot unsee. And so that world that you want to cling to is already gone. And you can try to convince yourself that that's not the case, but in the end, you know, it happened. So as much as there have been wonderful, wonderful, beautiful things that have happened in my life since then, and hard moments, I still think that that was what I had to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Josh, you have a little bit more distance. What about you? Would you do it again?
Yeah, of course, you know, without hesitation. But I also think that ultimately, you know, in all of our cases, this isn't just about us. I think, you know, our resignations make news because they are a access point to something more important, more meaningful. And so, of course, I would, you know, resign again over the same issues. The thing I don't want to see happen again or continue to see happening is the suffering that we are seeing as a result of American policies, the tens of thousands of lives lost, the harm that is being done, and including in that the harm that is being done to our own national interests and to our own civil society here at home. Those are the things I wish we could see undone and not repeat, and I'm sure both of you in the respective areas that you're thinking about, those are the things we would like to see changed. You know, our resignation is just a small part of that.
Yeah. And John?
Yeah, I wasn't going to have anything to do with the perversion of our system of justice. There's no way I could have done it, and I would resign again without hesitation. But if I were to do it again now, kind of understanding a little bit more of the consequences of it, I think it would be a much more somber decision as opposed to what at the time felt more kind of reactionary.
Yeah. Would you all, you know, John, would you ever go back to the State Department? John, would you go back to the Justice Department? And Josh, would you go back to the State Department eventually if it started to align again? And then Liz, would you go work for a big tech company again, especially, you know, we see where we are with AI at this point. Yeah. Liz, you start.
It's interesting that you asked that question because the field of AI has changed a lot since 2022. And as much as I would have loved to continue working on AI safety as a CEO of my own company, the world where you used to have to advertise that you were doing things in a safe way went away a long time ago. And so we actually closed my company this year. Which was incredibly hard to do, and we did have a few moments where we could have pivoted our product into something not safety related and joined the bandwagon and, you know, been on the hilltops singing about how AI was going to be able to do everything that humans could do. But at the end of the day, like before, it wasn't why we started the company. It wasn't what we set out to do. And so we decided to move on, and it was a really hard decision, but one that, again, you know, we just had to make.
Is it because people, like, safety when it comes to AI is not a priority, something that people don't want to know about at this point?
I think it's worse than that, you know, when you look at what's happened over the last year with an executive order outlawing woke AI, which is really, you know, code word for responsible AI and the sort of anti-discrimination assessments and audits that our field, you know, pioneered. It used to be required, and now I think it's even more, it works against you if you say that you care about AI safety from a commercial standpoint. Obviously, there are communities and nonprofits that still care about this stuff, but if you're looking to be the next OpenAI or compete with OpenAI or even just get a deal with OpenAI, you sort of have to be in that ideological mindset that, you know, we should just let AI do everything that we can as quickly as we can without regard for, you know, who might get hurt along the way.
Yeah, yeah. Would you guys go back to justice and state?
I mean, I think I probably would, but I've got to say, having witnessed this kind of wholesale manipulation and politicization of the federal government agencies and the civil service, it makes it a much less attractive proposition. Even if this doesn't happen again, ever. It just, the loss of credibility and the fact that it could happen makes it, for me, a much less attractive proposition.
Mm-hmm. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't leave the State Department because I didn't enjoy the work. I didn't, have that feeling and that sense and the commitment to service. Since leaving, I've now created a new organization called A New Policy, which, our theory of the problem here is, so we're trying to address exactly the set of issues of US policy towards Israel and Palestine, not as a policy problem, but as a political problem, because that's what it ultimately is. And I think, the idea that, State Department in this context, that I would be able to go through a congressional confirmation hearing, based on my resignation, I think, right now it looks like an outlier. I think the test of whether we succeed in some ways is whether that political reality changes. And if it ever did, I would, of course, as I am now, I hope, be thrilled to continue to contribute to our nation. Absolutely.
Great. All right, so do we have any questions in the audience? The lights are really bright, so I can't really see. Okay, great. Right here in the, or does someone already have a mic? Mm-hmm. All right.
Hello, my name is Nathan. I'm over at the Harris School of Public Policy. Thanks for your time this evening. I do have a question, and it is specifically towards the weaponization of AI. U Chicago, we built the bomb. I'm currently in a course at Booth, co-sponsored by the Department of Government, looking at edge AI, data labeling for purposes of executing their mission. My question is, if you were to, how do you address the people who look at this and say, hey, you just walked out of the room that's, solving World War II. Like, you just left the Manhattan Project. You can stay in the room, you can, see this technology to its fruition. Some people would say that there is good in the application of some of this technology. Adversaries to this country, if you want to frame it that way, they're going to develop these technologies. They'll use it to benefit their population, their people, who their stakeholders are. How do you kind of look at that, where, like, when you leave the room, you lose the ability to influence the outcome that it's going, and anyone can take this. Sorry.
I think your question is one that I get asked a lot, and that's, if Russia and China are building it, then don't we need to build it as well? And honestly, that's not my question to answer. It's something that, I, as the worker who was hired under the pretenses of not working on military applications, as a private citizen, did not sign up for that type of work, because I believe that in our society, in our American society, there is a clear division between, the military and government workers, and then the rest of the people who have the ability to choose whether or not to participate in those kinds of questions. In many ways in this country now, people like me are being robbed of that ability to make that decision, because there's this blending of private work and public work and military work, not just for the United States, but if you work at Google, if you work at Amazon, you're now, involved in the hosting of data that either is contributing to ICE or is contributing to Israel's war efforts. And so if you have beliefs, it's becoming more and more difficult to actually insulate yourself from those types of projects. So ultimately, if I were working on the Manhattan Project, I would have actively chosen to go participate in that, and that wasn't the case for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you guys want to add anything, or are you good?
I mean, I would just say, I think it's a very personal decision. I think it's a valid point, and each person has to kind of weigh for themselves what they can personally tolerate and what, thinking about it from a utilitarian perspective, what they might be able to accomplish if they stayed. But I do think there's an aspect, depending on the situation, where if you stay and if you do take an action that you disagree with, You lend your own name, your own reputation, your office's reputation to what is being done, and to some degree, some would say, you become complicit. And so I do think everyone has a line, and everyone's line is different, but you can't, I think there has to be some bright line, otherwise you can justify anything.
I also don't know that we are a representative sample set here, right? Because for each of us, we left and we took the conversation with us. So yes, we weren't part of that conversation in that room, but we carried a conversation into a broader public space where it could be played out and maybe reverberate in that room. I know that, on the issue of US policy on Israel, Palestine, and Gaza and all that, there are 15 people who resigned publicly. There's at least 40 to 50 who resigned without making any sort of public statement, who didn't say this is why they were leaving. They just didn't want to be part of it. And I think maybe a future conversation, I don't know how you'd have it, but with them to ask exactly that question of if you leave the conversation in the room, but you don't take the conversation with you, then what is the impact there? I think that's the question.
That's interesting. Is there another question? Okay, right here.
My name's Kenneth Newman. I live in the neighborhood here. So I sort of want to ask the government employees, but more on the prosecutorial side. Would you say now that based on your experience and what we see in the media, that any incident in government which favors the Trump family, whether it's criminal or not, is never going to be prosecuted?
I think in this administration, it is unlikely that at the federal level you would see any prosecution that is adverse to the Trump family. But you didn't need me to say that.
All right, right here in the front row.
Hi, you all sort of briefly touched on this, but I wanted to ask if in your decision making, if you considered the fact that, or if you considered that somebody worse might come into the same position afterward, and did that affect your decision or not especially?
Yeah, whoever wants to answer.
I can go first on that one because it's a very easy answer for me. In the context that I was in, the decision-making power, the whole bureaucratic process, the policy review process had completely been closed out, so it wouldn't make any difference who was in the role because the directives were coming and the inability to question them were coming very much from the very top.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not convinced that that it just wouldn't have been possible for me to do that work at any point. I'm convinced also that people who did come in, I knew that they were going to be more aligned with the CEO. But again, we tried to change his mind and failed. So if I couldn't convince him directly, then I felt like my best shot at keeping that hope alive was to turn to the world and actually do work with the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots at the United Nations. They invited me to speak in Geneva. I actually did work with the Biden administration as a member of the National AI Advisory Committee. And so my attempts to convince one person became attempts to convince a much larger audience and people who actually had power to influence companies that were otherwise in their own right a dictatorship.
This is a slightly different point, but I think it's related to the question you asked. One of the things that I struggled with was feeling like I was abandoning the people that were staying, and not to be sentimental, but you develop relationships with your colleagues. Especially, I was in this office for over a decade, and it had kind of worked my way up. I had been shoulder to shoulder with a lot of these people when I came in to the office, and there were a lot of young people who had come in through what we call the honors program, who were recent law school grads, and who you really want to mentor and you're invested in. And so I did feel a real sense of responsibility to those people, and I just but I just couldn't stay.
It's almost like when you feel like you've lost your agency, you lost your voice, there's nothing left that can be done. This seems to be a theme here. There's a question in the back. Okay, great. Go ahead and stand so we can see you.
My name is Mateo. I'm a first year in the college, and thank you, first of all. Your talk is very interesting. Specifically about the State Department, I'm guessing that there are many such moments that might have been also controversial. How did you know that this one was the one where you needed to act, not any of the other moments that might have happened in the 10 or 12 years beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone working in the State Department or in any big bureaucracy, you recognize that there are going to be, you have to be sort of modest and humble in your expectations, that you are trying to do good, you are trying to do the right thing, but you're part of a very big system, and that there are going to be decisions that are made that you disagree with. And I think the most you can hope for in most cases is to have that incremental impact, to spark a discussion, to see what can be done to ameliorate or moderate some of the worst potential harms, to create new processes that can bring in new perspectives. And in my time in the State Department, worked on a lot of very difficult issues and always felt like there was that space for discussion. I really think that the difference here was, again, first of all, just one of the scale of harm that was being done, but most significantly, the complete shutting down of any ability to debate the policies, to debate the authorizations of arms transfers, even in the context of that harm. State Department is, as an organization, essentially set up to argue with itself. If you think about the arms transfer process, the bureaus that weigh in are the Regional Bureau, the Political Military Affairs Bureau, and the Human Rights Bureau. And they sort of throw a new arms sale in there, and they all argue amongst themselves until it sort of comes to consensus. And it was that was being taken away, much in the same way that it is taken away within an authoritarian dictatorship, where the person at the top decides this is the policy, no one can question it, and that's how you end up with such terrible decisions being made in authoritarian systems, because there isn't that debate. And that was, I think, what was unique in this context and remains certainly unusual, but perhaps now more a precedent for what we see under this administration than unique.
Right. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm a third-year undergrad. Thank you all for the talk. This question is for the three of you. Since your resignation, what's one thing you're proud of doing to challenge the wrongs that made you leave in the first place?
I'll go first. One thing that was important to me was to not really engage the media, especially in the immediate aftermath of my decision, because I didn't want it to tarnish kind of the clear distinction between the actions of the career prosecutors who resigned in protest and the actions of the political leadership that were out talking about it and sensationalizing it. But it was also important to me to show that the reason why, the core reason why I left was similar to what Josh was saying, the disregard for objective analysis. And so I have published and done some media engagement talking about things that there has been public outcry against the Trump administration about, saying that certain things are essentially equate to criminal bribery. For example, the law firms agreeing to provide pro bono services to Trump-supported causes in exchange for having the president drop executive orders targeting those law firms. There was an outcry that was bribery. There have been other examples like that. And it was important for me to come out and say, as someone who had really been a subject matter expert dealing with the criminal enforcement of anti-corruption laws for most of my career, that wasn't bribery. That, no matter how, that kind of reaction for political reasons is part of the problem. Even if you disagree with someone, you can't just go to the most extreme consequence and try to justify it because of how vehement your disagreement is with the action. And so I guess that's something that I feel like I've tried to contribute.
The work that I did on the militarization of AI wasn't exclusively limited to, global geopolitical issues as well. I was living in New York at the time and volunteered for a nonprofit that focused on reining in abuses of AI and technology for the NYPD. And this was, in the moment of the civil rights movement in reaction to the murder of George Floyd, and there was a lot of appetite for new laws and interventions. And I was a tiny part of a very large team of dedicated activists who've been working on it for years, but we did get a law passed in New York City that required NYPD to disclose what technologies and scary things they use to spy on us. And it sounds like a small thing, and in hindsight, we all wish that there had been more. We still wish that there were more. But we do know that the NYPD absolutely hates the Post Act. So we are doing something right. And there were many other elements like that, but also in my personal work, through my company, other orgs would come to us and they would give us their algorithms, their models, their AI, and say, is this discriminatory? Can you assess it for us? And through that work, we were able to help companies hire more people of color, more women, approve more loans for minority communities. So having that hands-on first-person account of the tangible results that we were able to achieve for these companies back when it was fashionable has been really the most rewarding thing that I've had.
Yeah, I think, for my part, I've been working pretty much constantly since I left to try and fix the problem that led to my resignation, and I think that's going to be the work of many more years to come. But I think you feel inherently a sense of pride in moving the ball forward and feeling that it's not just that there was something that was wrong and I didn't want to be a part of it and I walked away, but there is something that I think is wrong that is impacting so many people, all of us and around the world. And so taking a small part in trying to move that conversation forward, move the ball forward, and in the process, I have to say, meeting so many incredible people around the country and on this stage as well, it's just been an incredibly rewarding experience in seeing how much good there is out there and how many people are trying to do good. Yeah.
Well said.
All right.
Hi, I'm Nola. I'm a first year in the college, and I'm really curious about, your work in an organization that tries to change policy towards Israel and Palestine, and kind of what that looks like more granularly. Is it more lobbying, litigation in terms of addressing where U.S. policy doesn't align with U.S. law? I guess I'm just curious about the policy development process and how your work fits into that.
Sure. So first of all, I'll say there's no one right answer here, right? I think there's a lot of lanes when you look at a problem of this magnitude that have to be open. Litigation is one, public protest is one. Those aren't my lane. So the approach we're taking is essentially, look, there's been this massive shift in how the American public view this issue, but it doesn't seem to be translating into policy change. Why is that? And so what we are trying to do is build that connectivity, ultimately for the health of our own democracy, right? Between the will of the American people, and for that matter, our national interest and our national values, we hope, and the policy decisions that are being made at senior levels of government. And that is through, yes, lobbying. I'm a registered lobbyist now. Through advocacy, through building connectivity between what is happening on campuses around the country and what is happening in DC. And then, because this is America, separate part of the same sort of family organizations, political action, campaign contributions, money in politics, because that's our system as it works right now. So that's the approach we're taking, is essentially trying to address the political incentive structures that unfortunately, in many ways, matter more in many cases than the views of voters.
Great. Another question out there?
Hi, my name is Rohan Kramer-Guha. I graduated from the Harris School of Public Policy in 2024, and I'm also a former White House intern at the Council of Environmental Quality at the end of 2024. So all of you are doing very important work in advocating for your causes outside of the sectors you were in originally, but of course, there's a lot of headwinds in the world right now, a lot of adverse things happening. And my question is, what are some strategies and some things you try to keep in mind to keep going in the face of these enormous difficulties?
I really love this question, and I was hoping somebody would ask, honestly, because it was part of that same phone call that resulted from the encrypted email that I sent to an ACLU project head. And he told me his story, and his story began as, a younger career ACLU lawyer in the year 2001 who was fighting against the US government to try to get them to agree to stop torturing people. And if you remember, 2001 was a very difficult moment for this country. And it was the first time, and since then, many activists and attorneys who work for these nonprofits on causes, he told me that in those moments, they didn't think that they were going to win. They knew that they were going to lose every single case that they brought for years ahead. And that wasn't the point. The point was to lay the groundwork and leave breadcrumbs for a moment in the future when people like him had a better chance of success. And I think it's important to remember, and he did a great job of counseling me, and I also had the benefit of wonderful mentors who helped remind me that your number one job is to avoid burnout, to remember that even if things don't go your way, that it's not your fault, and things get worse, things get better, and if it's a fight worth fighting, then you can find joy in continuing that fight, regardless of whether or not you happen to be winning at this exact moment in time.
Great. Does anyone else want to answer that?
Just a kind of cheesy tagline came to mind. I mean, resistance can be its own reward. I think if the fight's worth fighting, you can find a lot of validation in doing the work.
I think 25 years of being a bureaucrat actually prepared me well for this, because I don't expect immediate, sudden, radical change. I know it's going to be incremental. And actually, I think that sort of steels you for what is, in all of these cases, a long and hard and difficult struggle. But that change is possible. And then the final thing I would add as well is, the importance of self-care. Both directly when people are thinking about resigning, people have called me up and said, I'm thinking about resigning. First thing I always say is that line from the airline, make sure your own mask is on securely before helping those around you. But also, as you're going through any of this, it can, of course, be stressful, both in terms of the demands on your time, sometimes the media stuff, the political pressures, and you've also got to take care of yourself, because you're not going to be able to help anyone else if you're not doing that.
Great. I think that's it for questions. We're out of time. Josh, Liz, John, thank you all so much for telling your stories. So inspiring. Thank you.